What's up, everybody? Welcome back to News Dose. And Sony just revealed their secret studio today. Yeah, this has been rumored for quite some time, and it's actually one of the reasons that we pay attention to job listings and, things like that. But it's now 100% official. PlayStation opened up a brand new studio, and I'll give you my thoughts about it, what they're working on, and why I'm also a little bit skeptical. Now, we do have a lot to get into today, though, so make sure to stay tuned for all of that as well. First, though, I do want to thank my supporters on Patreon and on YouTube memberships. Thank you just so much for what you do, and as usual, you will get this video through early access. Let's just go get right into things, though, starting off with this wave of reports that your physical library is in imminent danger. Yeah, you can see this tweet here by Hunter, and he said, "Disc rot will eventually make all physical disc games unplayable. Here's how long each format will last. CD, 50 to 100 years, DVD, 30 to 100 years, and Blu-ray, 20 years." Now, disc rot has been known about for quite some time. This is not new information, or at least to some extent. You often hear about this type of stuff from PlayStation 1 collectors. But the Blu-ray part of this report, that's the part that's catching a lot of attention online. The way some of these articles are written, and really even when it comes to this tweet, almost makes it sound like your PS3 games are going to simply die in just a few years. The PS3, it's going to be 20 years old here in just 2 years, which is really kind of crazy to think about in its own right. But is any of this actually true? Are your PS3 games actually going to die as soon as they turn 20 years old? Well, what I can say here is that no, I'm not expecting a mass graveyard of PS3 games next year. Depending on the expert that you ask, they'll say different things about Blu-ray discs. And, it also matters if it's a commercially pressed disc as well. Those do last longer. And I've heard they'll last all the way up to 50 years. And I've seen some people even claim that they'll last up to 100 years. So, like a lot of things in life, a lot of this is just going to depend on if you actually take care of your stuff and if you store it properly. Now, as for these reports that are currently going around, I'm not overly concerned about it for the time being. I think it's being a little bit over-exaggerated right now, and I'll just kind of leave it at that. Let me know, though, about what you all think about this. Are you concerned about your library of games or not? Oh, and Silent Hill F just got some more ratings, this time from the ESRB, Japan, and over in Europe. Most notably, it got an 18+ in Japan, which that's notable because this is actually a first for the series, partly because they're shooting for the goriest Silent Hill game yet. Now, I've seen some fans react to this somewhat negatively because some fans are a little bit concerned about how much they're deviating from the typical Silent Hill formula. I mean, it's set in a different location than usual, and it's going to be a little bit more gory than usual. But admittedly, I'm actually intrigued by what they're doing. I like the idea that it has a twist to its formula, albeit they're still focusing on some of the core elements that the series is known for. Now, whether the execution there, that's the really important part. That still remains to be seen. I mean, I still need to see some gameplay as one such example. We haven't seen that yet. But I think its story and its location sounds interesting, if anything else. However, another aspect about this ESRB rating is that it does kind of beg the question about when it will release. Surprisingly, Konami has yet to reveal its release window, so we haven't seen gameplay, we don't have a release window or anything like that, so there is this idea that it could release in 2026, but now that we have several ratings, some people are starting to wonder if this could actually indicate a 2025 release window. Now, this doesn't guarantee anything, don't take it that way, but a lot of times when we see these ratings pop up, it's at least a good sign that it could be sooner rather than later. So, we'll see what happens. Now, we're also hearing about another rumor that Starfield will soon come over to the PlayStation 5. And I mean, okay, quite frankly, we've heard a lot of these rumors, really even before the release of Starfield. So, I would somewhat approach this with caution, at least just a little bit. But this rumor is a little bit more curious in the aspect that it's not just simply coming from a self-proclaimed insider. Instead, what's happening here is that a PlayStation 5 logo was spotted on Bethesda's Creation Kit website for Starfield. This was then captured and shared on Reddit, which sparked a lot of speculation online. Now, Bethesda has since taken the PlayStation 5 logo off of their website, but the question still remains. Why exactly was it there in the first place? Is this a sign of what's to come, or was it simply an error and nothing else? And technically, it could just be an error. We can't rule that out. But I can also say that we can't really rule out the idea that it would come to the PlayStation 5. Bethesda earlier this year teased a big year for Starfield. That alone could have been a tease for the PlayStation 5, because we know for a fact that Microsoft is moving some of their games over to PlayStation. We just saw that with one of their biggest franchises, Forza Horizon 5. I mean, that's the reality of the situation. Xbox has kind of welcomed this type of speculation, and we can no longer simply rule something out as just an error. There's no red lines, as they've said. So, we'll see what happens with all this, but give me your predictions below. Do you think Starfield will be on a PlayStation 5 by the end of 2025, or do you think people are simply just looking too far into this specific situation? All right, now let's go talk about this new PlayStation studio that they're calling Dark Outlaw Games. This is Sony's secret studio headed up by Jason Blundell. And if you're unaware of who he is and why Sony gave him his own studio, he was the executive producer for Call of Duty Black Ops, the campaign design director for Call of Duty Black Ops 2, and the game director for both the campaign and zombie modes of Call of Duty Black Ops 3. So yeah, he's got a pretty good pedigree under his belt. But what makes this specific situation very different, and really you can even say somewhat bizarre, is that you might remember that he appeared on stage with Sony a few years back, but instead under a different studio name, Deviation Games. Him and Dave Anthony, both of which have a history with Call of Duty, formed Deviation Games, and they partnered up with Sony to make a AAA live service game. Now, at the time, Sony made that out to be a major announcement, but as we now know, it just never panned out, which has kind of been a theme for Sony with their live service games. Now, we can only speculate about exactly why that happened with Deviation Games specifically, but looking from the outside in, it seems to me that there was a difference in creative opinions. So, Jason Blundell left. And based on what we now know, it seems like Sony sided with him and gave him his own studio. Now, that also means that Sony ripped their funding away from Deviation Games, and they've since shut down. They are no more. And that's really where my excitement for this new announcement begins to become a little bit more tepid. I would love to sit here and just tell you all just how super excited I am about a game that I know very little about, but based on the very little information that we have for the time being, I have to keep things real with you all. What I'll kind of say here is that I'm glad that Sony formed a new studio. It's good to see that they're taking a creative risk, and hopefully it pays off for them. Now, at the same time, I look at Sony's recent history, and if this is truly another live service game, which it kind of seems like it probably is, then, more often than not, their live service games just don't pan out. I can point to Factions 2, Concord, which is one of the biggest flops of all time, their canceled God of War game, which made absolutely zero sense whatsoever. I could point to the Twisted Metal game. That never came to be. I could point to Foam Stars and just the graveyard of canceled live service games under Sony's direction, including actually Jason Blundell's previous game. And that's why I hear this announcement. And I just don't have the excitement in my heart. Until Sony actually proves that they have an eye for live service games in the 2020s, an announcement like this just doesn't do much for me. I can acknowledge that it's a big announcement, because anytime Sony forms a new studio, yeah, that's big. But at the same time, I also need them to actually prove themselves that they can actually make these type of games, assuming that it's another live service game. Now, technically, it might not be, but in all likelihood, it probably is. Now, if Sony would have formed a new studio and said that they were working on, let's just go and say, a new Uncharted game, well, then you're going to have my attention, because historically, Sony is actually really good at, making cinematic single-player games. But, we'll just have to kind of see how all this plays out. It's just kind of hard for me to get excited about a studio under Sony that's probably working on a live service game, and we know nothing about this game. So, it's probably going to be a few years before we get to see it ourselves. But I don't know. Let me know what you all think about all this in the comments below. Does it get you excited? Do you think I'm just being too harsh? Or, it's okay if you disagree with me. I'm perfectly fine with that. Just let me hear it in the comments below. Now, one last thing before we go, Famitsu recently released their player-voted Game of the Year. This is where Japanese gamers voted for their favorite games of 2024. And, some of this comes down to popularity. If a game sells more units, of course, that's going to give it a bigger advantage, so you have to kind of keep that in mind. But thanks to Genki, I'll go ahead and include the top 20 on screen here. And yeah, right away you can see that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth beat out Metaphor ReFantazio. I mean, truthfully, you can't go wrong with either game. They were both Game of the Year contenders easily. They're both top tier games for sure. Then at number 3, Dragon Quest III HD 2D. Obviously, Dragon Quest is a massive series over in Japan, so there's no surprise here. Now, a game that did surprise me, though, is Rise of the Ronin. I wasn't expecting it to be at number 4, but there you go. Japanese gamers really seem to have enjoyed Rise of the Ronin. Then skipping over to number 8, Astrobot. Now, I was a little disappointed that it didn't get a bit higher. This was my personal game of the year last year, but number 8 is still respectable. And then if you're wondering about Nintendo-made games, of course, they dominate over in Japan, so you'd expect to see a first-party game in the top 10, but not in 2024. Instead, their first game on the list appears at number 12, being Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. I mean, it was a slower year for Nintendo, being that transitional year with the Switch 2 right around the corner, but of course, with the Switch 2 right around the corner, we're also expecting a much better year in 2025. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this episode, but until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and peace out.